Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm director of Dia Art Foundation, and I'm incredibly happy to be back with the Verbier Art Summit for 2021. And huge thanks to Anneliek and the team at the summit. Also Beatrix Ruff, who I know has been working on these discussions for 2021. I plan to introduce the incredible speakers that we have today in alphabetical order, and to give a bit of background as to why they're being brought together for this continuation of what was the 2020 Verbier Art Summit that was titled Resource Hungry, Our Cultured Landscape and Its Ecological Impact. So following those short introductions, we're going to consider a few questions that emerged really from the last summit, and hopefully hear a lot more from our participants about their own work and thinking. Needless to say, so much has happened since 2020. It's almost hard to compute the time between then and now. Most significantly, of course, the horrific toll that COVID-19 has taken and continues to impact us all. And the fact that certainly, at least here in the US, this impact has been so disproportionately affected the Black communities here and communities of color and the poor in ways that are still tragically unfolding. But at the same time, we've also had an incredible outpouring of justified protest and resistance, calling attention to systemic racism and demanding change. And speaking for my own institution, I think we've also experienced a really powerful shift in our thinking, a kind of refocus and centering our attention on people rather than things. And I'm really deeply grateful to the work that the community that I have at DIA has been undertaking. So the three women that I'm really honored to introduce today are all activists, interpreters, creators, documentarians of our society and environment. And without taking up more time, I'd like to swiftly introduce them and say a few words, and then of course hear from them about their own work. So Andrea Browers. Andrea joined us in Verbier last year and spoke really powerfully about her work to bring attention to activists, those she's championed now and followed for many years. Andrea spoke in particular about her environmental work with activists like John Quigley and the tree sitting movement in California, as well as her more recent work with Dakota Iron Eyes, a Standing Sioux tribe member from South Dakota. So I have always had and continue to have great respect for Andrea's work, that like Jamila Ribeiro, who was the feminist scholar from Brazil, who also spoke last year with us, plays an incredibly important role in writing these underdocumented histories. So Andrea, welcome. Thank you for being with us. And I think by way of introduction, you're going to show a short film.
Right. So during COVID, I've been traveling up to Northern California in the area where the big redwood trees are. And there have been a group of tree sitters up there who've been around for a long time, but this is a new generation of tree sitters. They're called the Redwood Forest Defenders. And they're dealing with a company called Green Diamond. It's an area that's been a really famous spot for tree sitters where people, goes back to like the Earth First movement. They've been trying to save these trees for these forests for a really long time. And recently a company called Green Diamond has been harvesting and they've been clear cutting. And they do it they've changed the way they represent their company, and they represent their company as like an environmentally friendly company, when in fact they're clear cutting.
Clear cutting is a logging practice that removes all the trees from a site. When you clear cut, literally everything is cut down, all of the logs are hauled away, and then the area regrows all at the same age. And so the result is a tree plantation.
Basically what they do is they cut any tree that they deem to be profitable or in the way, and there are regulations in place that will salvage a couple of trees. Like in this area behind me that I'm looking out at, there's like 2 or 3 redwoods that got marked as wildlife. That's what our conservation laws get us, is 100 acres of clear cut, 2 trees left behind.
I love talking about greenwashing. It's so rampant and it's becoming more so, and I think it's really sinister and dangerous marketing strategy. Greenwashing is the phenomena where corporations lie to us and tell us that things are sustainable when they're really not. And it's a marketing tool they use to increase their profits. So Green Diamond is a subsidiary of Simpson Industries. A lot of the forests that they're cutting now, they've already cut before, but now they have a new name. They've rebranded, and Green Diamond, the name they adopted several years ago, is kind of their effort to like appear to be a sustainable company or to be like looking out for the land. So Green Diamond holds third-party certification with the Forest Stewardship Council. And the Forest Stewardship Council started as an entity in conversation with environmental nonprofits that was supposed to hold the timber industry accountable, but what it's turned into is actually just a marketing tool for the timber industry. And if you look at your paper products in your home or your workplace, you'll see the FSC stamp on a lot of it. The more I learn about FSC, the more I think that FSC is allowing the timber industry to lie to consumers about the real impacts of the products they're buying. And that, to me, is like a classic example of greenwashing. In theory, it's supposed to hold polluting or ecocidal industries accountable and inform consumers, but what's actually going on is consumers are being duped and the companies are getting away with murder. And corporations know that people are beginning to develop like consciousness around the environment, and this has been happening for decades, but right now, because climate change is threatening life itself so in such a dire way, a lot of people are thinking and talking about this stuff, and corporations know that, and they know how to milk it, and they're responding with all kinds of products. But we know that true solutions and truly what is truly environmentally friendly doesn't cost money. Like anything that they're selling us is automatically environmentally destructive, and a for-profit capitalist company will never really be looking out for like the land or for its workers or like its consumers, you know, or the people. And something I forgot to mention about FSC is that it's not just like it makes a consumer feel good when they buy it, it also garners the company a higher price for that product. And that's what's most sinister about it. And you see this in the grocery store, you see this anywhere you're buying things, you see that the things that are supposedly more environmentally responsible or sustainable often cost more money. And it makes sense that it would cost more money to, you know, grow a tomato with compost than with chemical fertilizers, especially when the most extractive industries and products are all subsidized by our government. But it feels like a very dangerous situation where companies can make money off of branding things as eco-friendly.
So we had invited Carolina Caycedo to join us in Verbier for the 2020 summit, but sadly she wasn't able to come. So I'm really honored and happy that she's with us here today. Carolina was important to the discussion that we're having then and now for her really remarkable work that has addressed specifically the privatization of resources, loss of biodiversity, and environmental justice in works that use a variety of media. Given the proximity of Verbier to the immense Mauvoisin Dam that was built in the 1950s, I was especially interested in hearing Carolina reflect on her project Be Damned, which is an ongoing work since 2012, which has manifested itself in film and performance, books, and other media, and looks at the privatization of the Magdalena River in Colombia and the communities that have been affected. The work has unfolded over the years, and I'm hoping that we might hear a bit more about that, but also the many other works that Carolina has undertaken that address many of the issues that were pertinent to the 2020 summit. So Carolina, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
So thank you, Jessica, and thank you for the folks at Verbier for inviting me. I'm gonna start by showing a few minutes of this clip called To Stop Being a Threat and to Become a Promise. It is a two-channel video installation that on one side, the left side, has images of communities engaged like in collective work, in this case, cooking together. And on the other side, the right side, there's images of probably the kind of a different approach to nature, which would I call a corporate approach, the approach that builds dams, that channels our rivers, or that envisions what I call common goods as resources that are there for our exploitation to gain wealth. So I think about my artwork, and I think art has the possibility of breaking the kind of authoritarian spell we find ourselves as a society, as humanity. And that's what I wanted a little bit with this video, that the left side with all its color kind of threw a visual spell into the right side and started kind of distorting these images of corporate nature or of man-built or corporate-built structures, such as the Hoover Dam in this case, and kind of started distorting them and making them something else. No, I think, you know, art has the possibility to, or as artists, we have the possibility of doing visual resistance, right? And part of that resistance has to do with breaking that authoritarian spell that, you know, corporate images or oppressive structures like have right now over us as a society, I think. And in that sense, I think this piece is a recent piece from last year. It's called From the Bottom of the River. It's a hand-blown glass with a couple of cast nets over it, kind of trapping it. I was trying to refer to the nature that looks back at us and holds us accountable, but also thinking about those entities that look at us from the bottom of the river. You know, if we're going to speak about common goods, or what other people call natural resources, if we're going to speak about the environment, I think it's important that we take the non-human epistemologies and the non-human entities also into account. So with this piece From the Bottom of the River, I was trying to speak also about those entities that look back at you. But in this piece, I was also trying to refer to, well, a sad thing for a lot of us in Latin America is all the bodies that have been disposed into rivers and the violence that comes with defending natural entities. And unfortunately, our rivers, as much as sources of joy, they're also depositories of death, unfortunately. So this piece also speaks about all those ancestors in struggle who are laying down in the river, looking at us, up at us, I want to talk a little bit about this piece too, that's called The Collapsing of a Model. The events of this week here in the United States with the political turmoil, also kind of makes me think that there's a model that's kind of crumbling around us, slowly, kind of clinging to its power. But it also has to do, and I think it's not only in the political, maybe things and events that are surrounding us, but also physically with crumbling infrastructure. This idea of collapsing of a model also has to do with not only thinking about this infrastructure that's crumbling around us, but what can we do to bring this infrastructure down before it like falls on top of us, right, and kills us straight up. And this was a bit the invitation with this piece, to look at this view from above, satellite images of infrastructures that are in danger of collapsing, of have collapsed, and kind of prompt a debate about how can we think about deconstructing infrastructures instead of constructing even more and more. And I just wanted to finish with this images, which is a little hourglass filled with gold, just to speak about how time is like clicking on us, and that it's very eminent that we start taking action before, this collapsing of a model really falls on us and doesn't leave us any other way to get out of the situation.
Thank you, Carolina. So I'll just jump in and introduce you, Elvira. So Elvira Dyangani Ose is the director of the Showroom in London, and through her curatorial, art historical, and really discursive work has brought attention in particular to collective and collaborative practices that explore socially engaged work. I've long appreciated Elvira's commitment to work that maintains a light footprint, whether that's through non-objective practice, performative work, or the current wonderful project that's underway at the Showroom now in Fluorescence that brings together sound, art, and dialogue. And if you haven't been watching this series, you should go to the Showroom's website and take a look. Elvira has challenged the norms of institutional spaces and given platform to artists who work outside of the conventional gallery realm. And I hope that we'll hear from her today too about her current work and thinking. So thanks so much, Elvira, for joining us again.
It's always my pleasure to be in dialogue with you. It was such a great experience with Anneliek and the team at Verbier. And so I'm excited to continue some of the issues that were highlighted then. I mean, I also love the fact that I'm the presence of these extraordinary artists. I was so interested when you invited me to consider this because, of course, I have been working with some artists that in various, let's say, with several different strategies, look at the formula of addressing environmental awareness, right? And a multi-species theory that takes into consideration the non-human collaborators. I thought that was critical to consider also how much of the social landscape, how much of the community we can consider also as an intangible heritage, right? That is there to be perished together with an environment that perhaps is surrounded by. And I remember at the time we had a conversation about the way in which, if before, and particularly I'm thinking in the work that Dia produces, no? And an incredible legacy that is of the certain art forms in the landscape, in nature, that your organization, your institution take care of. And the way in which perhaps there is a sense in some of the artists we work with, Tiaster Gaze, and I have worked with in my career, both within Showroom and outside, now Recetas Urbanas, but also the work of Encale Jacompa, or some of the conversation we are having with artists, Oliver Ressler, right? And his intention to create a recording of some of the most critical issues around the environment from different perspectives. It was also this sense of how much of the making of a critical awareness has to do as well with a sense of, I guess in the you say it beautifully, Carolina. I was writing it here, no, like this sense of visual resistance, right? And the way in which there is, for me, also a sense of critical awareness, a profound gesture of affection, right? That is built both with the artist gesture and the people's agency and energy, right? To come together in a sort of extraordinary symbiosis. But there is a sense of, as I was saying, this sense of the possibility of creating an active citizenry, the possibility of generating temporary communities around a sense of critical awareness that in my case, I feel it comes in a very specific way, which is political as well as it is aesthetic in the work of artists, that I feel is important to go back to a sense in which, you know, silent stories or silent communities find, as it happens in Andrea's beautiful documentary, a voice and a platform, right? So this sense of symbiosis, both with the non-human collaborator, but also with those essences, with those worlds, as you were saying at the introduction, Jessica, no, the underdocumented histories, I think is fundamental for all of us, right? Like I think I build most of my programming around certain absences, or at least absences from a certain mainstream. But also perhaps another issue that is important to me, and here is again a moment where the artist is not necessarily at the top of a pyramid. It is one more in a let's say in a collective voice and a collective consciousness, but that has the capacity, both in terms of their platform, their voices, your voices, as an institutional platform, but also as we do in terms of our institutions, right? To give capacity, to give platform to these under-documented stories. I was thinking a lot about what you were saying also, Carolina, in terms of the rituals, right? And how important it was for us to see nature from the perspective of this incredible resource of traditions, right? And I was thinking in how critical has been during this pandemic for our organization for the first time. And I guess for me also to be more courageous than I was before, since I joined the showroom, to reflect on ourselves, but not necessarily as a self-centered discourse, but as we bring together, let's say, the human aspect of what it means to run an organization. And I like to refer to both of your practice in a way from the perspective of generosity, right? Like, can dissidence be almost an act of profound generosity? And how important it is that we are self-aware, as much as the artist is, as much as the activist is, of our political role, our crucial role as individuals to demand certain action. So some of the words that I like to bring forward, and I hope that we can discuss about this, had that sense, no? In which affection is something other than just generosity per se. Is almost a sense of generosity towards oneself, no? Preserving this planet has to do with that. No? I had to say, and this is very parochial perhaps, but I did, walking among trees every day for an hour here in London has saved my sanity during these several lockdowns. No? And I feel we underestimate the power that nature can have in our spirit. And I feel like this sense of like land, water, no? I'm thinking of the Maori community, I'm thinking of some First Nations in Canada, thinking about the land being part of one's body, that I feel like is something that we can recover, that we bring back.
Thank you so much, Elvira. Wow, so much to take from that. I think we're going to come back to a lot of those ideas as we continue our discussion. At the end of the last summit, and again, thank you, Elvira and Andrea, for both being there and again now, we tried to summarize some of the key questions that emerged, some of which I think really you were just touching on, Elvira. One that resonated across so many talks was this need to reassess really our spaces, our habits, our structures, systems of culture, in order to think of new ways to operate and to experience. And I think I'd add to that what you were saying, Carolina, that Elvira picked up on too, which is also finding new myths, new gods, new rituals. And I was wondering, maybe Carolina and Elvira, if you could speak to this call for change that has always been part of your practices, and sort of this aspect of transforming institutions through art or through your own work, running institutions in Elvira's case, and perhaps maybe part of that to think about how the last 9 months perhaps have affected your sense of these priorities, or not. Perhaps it's been a clarification rather than a shift in focus.
I think it's important to, when in the process of reassessing, not necessarily to come up with something new, but maybe also to look back, like in African philosophy, it's called Sankofa. In the Andes philosophy, we say we need to look back in order to move forward. And the answers are there in indigenous and traditional knowledge and practices. It's not that I'm romanticizing that we have to go back to, a prehistory or anything like that. But I think there's a lot of clues in those practices that have been so resilient and that are so important that, continue to be carried into today. through ancestral knowledge. So, that I think it not necessarily has to, we have to construct more and more or to come up with new things, but maybe take from what, has been working and adapt it to, this present circumstances, for example. Remember, we have to remember, it is in us. It is in us. And I think that extractivism, resource hungry, what worries me more about extractivist processes is not that they are extracting all these resources, as some call it, or these goods, but at the end they're extracting our knowledge too, as our bodies are places for extraction, and we are being extracted at this moment too. Our knowledge, our what we call maybe embodied knowledge, the knowledge we carry in our muscles, our memory muscles. We've been extracted of that. So it's about remembering, reconnecting, adapting. I would say for me, that's how I approach it, and that's what I've been trying to do also. So unlearning too, because we have learned through academic patriarchal structures certain ways, even in the arts, as art practitioners. So it's about unlearning those oppressive structures too. And in that sense, how do we look at nature? How do we represent nature through the art and not through the colonizer gaze that we've been taught through academy, or through given ways of filming, or of talking about natural entities. So that's how it's been working for me. And of course, during COVID, becoming a mom again, giving birth during the pandemic, going inside, that introspection, connecting to that, I had my baby at home, connecting to that knowledge as women that we carry. We have the power to nurture. That's a power, that's the resistance we have. We continue to nurture and we continue to sustain life, even in the midst of a pandemic. And as artists, we have the power to nurture the soul and to nurture ideas too. So that's a little bit what's been going on for me during this pandemic. Of course, everything in a very intimate space, and thinking very much of, if I'm the artist of my block, what is my role in my block? What can I give to my neighbors as an artist?
That's so extraordinary, Carolina, because I feel like there is something about the humanness, right? Like there was something, we did a project in the public space because it was one of the ways, online, and the sort of like the fluid version of the showroom was one, and the other was a public space. And for me, there, I thought, what needs to be here is something that is, handwriting, something that can show the human error, something that allowed me to bring the intimacy of the spaces that we all now are captured by into this big screen, into this real estate, into this intervention, this interruption of advertising in Piccadilly Circus. But also for us, the position, and I love that you say, like, if I'm the artist of my blog, what is my role? No? Because I feel like for me, it's always context, right? But it also was the fact that I consider with my colleagues, and I say, I always work from where I am. This is it, position, orientation. I'm here, this is my moment, this is what I might want to address. And it's not about me, it's about the surrounding, how I bring this context to the conversation. And one thing we did was actually to go to the past. And not necessarily to the past of the 2 years, but as I was saying, in terms of questioning the organization, we went to the past moments of the organization. We went back to artists and reclaimed some of the conversations that we had with them because we deemed they're so important for the moment, right? And most of the things, interestingly enough, that we recovered were ways in which we could address, like radical curiosity, how people were using walking in nature as a way of assuming certain aspect of knowledge, going to ideas on sonic power within fluorescent to try to address knowledges and epistemologies in different ways, right? Try to bring back a sense of the aesthetic education, right? And education of the individual from that perspective. Understanding that, of course, academia has, and it always will have a lot to offer, but there are ways in which knowledge can be transmitted in other realms. And because we didn't have those rituals, whatever domestic or actually conforming within an ideology anymore, we needed to reinvent some more. And those could maybe, bring together a large community, but also bring the four of us or two of us or one on his own. No? So I feel like for me, I'm also a mom. So all those things have been crucial, no? Like going back to this sense of being a mom. We don't do it as often when we work outside home. And I feel like that there is the sense of transforming, if there is something that I think is important and has to do with this self-awareness or awareness as a human of both our impact on Earth, but also the incredible potential we have to transform that. It's not over. We can still do a lot. So I feel like so bringing that to the position of the organization has been also very important.
Just to respond quickly also, it's interesting what you say. Right now at this point, what is like weaving us together is our vulnerabilities, no? Mm-hmm. And that's something that we should like deal with and think about. I just want to leave it there. Like how our vulnerabilities is what is weaving us together at this point, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the, climate emergency we are in, political emergency, fascist governments popping up everywhere, so that's interesting to think as a starting point for action, vulnerability as a starting point for action.
I was thinking while you were talking, I mean, that a lot of what it's about empathy too, no? I mean, this capacity to encounter our lives in such a different way. The next question picks up on something that you've all touched on to some degree as well, but two very powerful and memorable talks last year were by Adrian Lahoud and Jamila Ribeiro, and they were both speaking quite specifically to the role of indigenous communities and how important their role is in really our capacity to rethink our relationship to the environment, as you were touching on already, Carolina. In Australia and Brazil, respectively, the sites that they were referring to, they pointed to how much, of course, we can learn from this light touch and the holistic thinking that, of course, has existed for centuries. So I was wondering, maybe Andrea and Carolina, as you've both thought so much about this, I wonder if you can speak to the lessons that you've learned in your work where you've been addressing indigenous cultures in very different ways, of course, and working with different groups and individuals.
I think that, having made the documentary film with Tokata Iron Eyes, where we went to, which is part of what I showed the year before, we went to 5 of her favorite sacred sites in South Dakota. One of those sites was the Black Hills. And the Black Hills is, one of the most sacred sites for the Lakota peoples. And it also has like, it's also, it's like called Custer Park, which is like a horrible violation. So, because, Custer is responsible for so much of the genocide of indigenous peoples. So it's just horrible. And, to see Tokata in those native grounds, and then to just see like people just hiking and walking by and not understanding how important that land is. Like, it was like visceral. And so I started thinking about the land back movement, and I took a course with Dr. Caitlin Reed, who is, writing and speaking about the land back movement. And I don't know if people know what that is. So I just thought it was like really important to kind of explain. There's that it means the return of all public lands back to indigenous peoples. And I think that's a really important idea. So, you know, in the Black Hills, you know, you have one of the most, it's Mount Rushmore is there, you know, which is like this giant, horrible portraits carved into mountains, you know, of like these kind of white supremacist colonizers. And I think that's one of the sites that's really like at the foreground of the land back movement. And I just wanted to bring that. I don't think that I'm the right person to speak about it really, but I think that, you know, if you just Google land back, or there's an organization called NDN. I think, is it .org? Anyway, I think that, I don't know what it is, but I think that it's really important to think about this. And I think it's, so, you know, I think we were talking about, I think that part of my, a huge part of my work is not only about undertold stories of activists, but I also do think it's about unlearning. You know, I think that, you know, the education I got, which was like, you know, public school education, just taught me all these lies. And I think it's really important that as artists, we're not at the top of the pyramid. You know, we're part of a collective, and part of what we can do is like allow people to untell these histories. Carolina was talking about this, and tell them in more accurate ways, because so much of my education is a giant lie, and it's going to take a lifetime to undo that, if not more.
Yeah, I think touching upon the process of land back is really important. There are similar movements happening across Latin America, for example, and probably you heard this from Naine in the past summit, the idea of demarcación ya. So having indigenous peoples be able to demarcate what is indigenous land in Brazil is a big movement there. And it is very important that, you know, to respect that sovereignty and to give them the land back, basically. You know, I totally agree with that. If we look at the best or the most diverse places on planet Earth, these places are where indigenous peoples live and thrive today and have lived for millennia. You know, they have, you know, it's not debatable. it's the fact that they have been the best stewards of these places, and they have taken care of this biocultural diversity for generations. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and to, you know, as much as radical it may sound, to, you know, be behind processes of land back, as you know, you, Andrea, and other artists and other civil society members have been doing. I think that's an important process, you know, very important step, or maybe a goal, actually. What I've learned of indigenous philosophies, or working close to indigenous people, is that embodied knowledge, I had mentioned it before, embodied knowledge is so important to tap into what we have inherited from our ancestors, and we carry with us through memory, through ritual, you know, that allows us to connect to place, to locations in very different ways, but also allows us to, how can I say, maybe to perform, or not to perform, but to embody knowledge. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, knowledge is not what we speak about, or what we speak our minds, or what is in our art alone, but it's how we carry ourselves, how we act in the everyday context. You know, I think the biggest learning for me is this consequence that indigenous life and indigenous philosophy carries within it. You know, it's this, they do what they say. You know, in Western society, sometimes we have all these talks, all these summits, all these artworks that are speaking about something, but then we go back to our everyday life. We don't recycle for X or Y reason, or, you know, or we're nasty people, you know, you encounter that a lot too, people who, you know, so it's really, how can we, you know, really weave together what we're thinking about, what we're expressing through our work, through our writings, and how can we weave that with our everyday action? I think indigenous life, ancestral ways of life really weave that together, you know, the base of the resistance being the care that we have, the love that we have for that place, that location, you know, that sacred mountain, our sacred rivers, or the tree that's maybe cleaning a little bit the air of our, you know, or of our block again, you know. I think that's one of the things I've learned, to care more deeply about stuff, and then to carry this care into my everyday actions.
At the end of the 2020 summit, Daniel Maselli from the Swiss development agency SDC spoke really powerfully about the need for what he described as a total rethink of our values in order to have any hope in arresting climate change. The last few months have seen increased focus on this need for new models and new institutions that we've been talking about, and a deep, deep questioning of our values in society. I was wondering, Elvira and Andrea, if perhaps you can speak to the work that you've been engaged in or witnessed, where you can also identify a hopeful change for the future.
I mean, I think that one of the sort of slogans that I've been working with is grief and hope, because I felt so much, I've been thinking a lot about eco-grief. I think I talked about this the year before, the idea that, you know, every time a species is put on the extinction list, or, you know, every time a forest burns, you know, I mean, what has burned in California this last year has been horrific, or every time a tree is cut. I feel a real sense of grief, but I also see myself immediately pushing past that and kind of ignoring it. And I'm trying not to ignore that grief. And I think that, so I've been really interested in listening to and focusing on youth activists. And I think that that's where we're going to rethink our values, hopefully. I also, and this is maybe not answering your question, I have been very conceptually based artist, just in terms of an artist. And I have been very critical of aesthetics. You know, I've used aesthetics, I think, politically as sort of propaganda, you know, to try to get people to change their thinking politically, you know, and maybe doing it from a more, I think that art really touches us viscerally, you know, that so embodied, like Carolina was talking about. I believe that there is hope in a lot of these movements, you know, like the movement for Black Lives, the Land Back. I think looking at like ecofeminist movement, looking back and looking forward is like really important. And that there are hope, there's a lot of hope in those ideas if we can implement them. And so working locally and working, you know, within your local communities, our local communities, and that's all we can really do right now in a lot of ways, is maybe also where we find hope to implement these strategies.
In my case, I thought something that you were saying earlier, Andrea and Carolina, and I thought on the idea around empathy, but also what one can do in relation to that. And one of the things that I thought that it was important that came to mind immediately is being consequent, right? Like really, there are so much understanding, awareness, knowledge, at time information, misinformation, right? Like, and once we are given the tools for the agency, what do we do, right? Like being consequent with that, for me is critical. And I had to say, like at the institutional level, one thing that had kept me going, and I'm really excited to be part of that, is the institutional relationship, which is very intertwined. No? I was almost like writing that there is an essence and a possibility. It exists in many ways, but it's also even more in potential, that an interstitial engagement of both institutions and also communities and, let's say, non-human collaborators in those surrounding. And to me, one space in particular that had changed my address of what the understanding of community means, what education means, what care mean, which is also something that I will bring here, no? Like care as the drive, as Carolina was saying, of the new myth, no? The mythical beginning.
Thank you both. And thank you, all three of you, and for taking so much time. I know you've all got many things to go back to, families and work, but certainly I feel like I have many notes and I'm digesting what you said. And I think there's so much to take from that. And I'm happy also to bring you together, because I think the voices between are really the incredible thing with these conversations. And hopefully there will be more between the three of you as well, because that was really very, very memorable things brought up.